sexuality, starting since yesterday and going till today, calling me and texting me. And I was thinking this morning, this is exactly what life is like in Gaza. I mean, not exactly, but it's just a small taste in the sense that everything is governed by a shattering psychological reality of uncertainty. You could never predict if you will be able to leave, if you will be able to enter, at what point will you be, approved to get a travel permit, on one hand by Israeli authorities to go and study in the West Bank, on the other hand by Egypt to exit through the Rafah crossing. This is life in Gaza. Nothing is as it seems. You have no semblance of control over anything, whether it's the air you breathe or the water that you get or when you can turn on the lights, where or how you could study, whether or not you can access certain healthcare facilities. This is life in Gaza right now. And it has been, I should say, for the past more than 10 years. As you will see, and I hope that you will learn today. Is this thing up or are we still going? Oh, okay, so I'll just keep going. Oh, the mic, yes. Okay. All right, so it's my pleasure to, start off the sessions today. And, I do want to speak a little bit from a personal perspective. Maybe I'll start with that while the slides are going up. I grew up in the Gulf in Saudi Arabia. I was born in Kuwait, and we would summer in Gaza every year. Oh, awesome. And my parents were both born in the Gaza Strip, were physicians who studied in Egypt, and then in 1967, when Israel formally occupied what would then become the Gaza Strip, they were rushed back from Egypt by the Red Cross because they needed physicians, and they were some of the first to obtain what would then be known as the Hawiyya, or the ID card that sort of governs every aspect of life for Palestinians as we know it in the occupied Palestinian territories. And I probably have a slide of Hawiyya somewhere here. Let me see. Maybe I'll just fast forward and go to that, since I already began with the... There we go. Okay, so this is a Hawiyya. And so when what happened is Israeli authorities went house to house, ran a population census, and whoever was accounted for was then counted as part of the Palestinian population, which was not referred to as Palestinian, of course, at the time. It was just the Arab residents, and were given this card, right? If you happen to be outside of those territories at the time, if you were in, say, Kuwait, like my uncle, teaching, like many Palestinians at the time, visiting family, whatever, studying, you automatically became a non-resident. As far as they were concerned, you just sort of ceased to exist, right? As a Palestinian, as an Arab resident, leading, of course, far before that, the late Mahmoud Darwish to write the famous poem Identity Card, write down, I am an Arab, right? Not a Palestinian, and my number is 9654, whatever. So we became numbers, right? And without this card, we also lacked the ability to move, and I don't want to say freely, to move to the specific territory that was marked on the card. So in our case, it was Gaza. It only gave us the right to move in and out of the Gaza Strip through specific crossings approved by Israel at particular times. It did not, and it still does not, allow me the right, even as an American citizen, to travel to the West Bank or Jerusalem, right? So I can't do that. And because my children are added to the card, it also doesn't allow them to travel to those areas. So they're subject to the same sorts of travel restrictions. My American citizenship is sort of rendered irrelevant. Once I go, immediately I'm on the Israeli systems. You're a Palestinian resident. You can only travel through the Rafah crossing through Egypt, subject to, of course, Egyptian restrictions, which can now take days or weeks at a time to be able to cross Sinai, to get to the Rafah crossing, to be approved to enter Gaza, and then leaving is a whole different story. There's another added complication. If, as a Palestinian with a Hawiyya, you then marry another Palestinian or non-Palestinian, in my case, a Palestinian refugee who grew up in a refugee camp in Lebanon, in Baalbek, whose parents were forced to flee from their native Haifa in 1948, you can't add your spouse to your ID card without Israeli approval. This process is known as family unification and is sort of central. I'm just focusing a little on this because it's really central to understanding the way that Israeli occupation and settler colonialism fractures the very sort of intimate, private spaces of Palestinian life and society. So my husband, even before he married me as a Palestinian refugee, was denied a right to return or visit his native homeland. Even after he married me, he was also unable to travel or visit my home in Gaza because our family unification application was never approved. It's sort of still been lingering since 2004. So whenever I traveled to Gaza after we got married, it was by myself or with my children. And this is I'm just one example of tens of thousands of Palestinians who lack family unification permits or lack ID cards. So you might have one spouse who has a Hawiyya and the other who doesn't. So, going back to growing up, my parents every summer would take us to Gaza, at that point through the Jordanian crossing into Gaza, ultimately leading to Gaza. Soon it changed and we were not allowed to use the Jordanian crossing anymore. We had to go through Egypt. And as children, we never understood, why are we being forced to go through this really tortuous, days-long journey? At that point, during the first Intifada, Israeli forces would stop us. It would give us constant waiting and uncertainty. And I think it was Rashid al-Khalidi who said famously that it is at borders that the Palestinian identity sort of surfaces and crystallizes. Getting strip searched, being told to strip down to our underwear and our clothes being put in a huge pile in front of us and our shoes in the other. And when the strip searches were complete, we would just be told in groups to go and fetch your things, put them back on, find your bags, which were hand searched, and then be on your way. And so this was sort of formative in my childhood experiences and in shaping my Palestinian identity and my understanding of what it was like to be stateless and completely invisibilized, from textbooks, atlases, dictionaries, news, magazines, books. I remember as a child, and this is a very common experience, looking through frantically, where are we? I don't see ours on maps anywhere. And I remember in 4th grade drawing a map. We had a project draw, and I didn't know at the time. I couldn't even articulate what it was, and it just said Israel everywhere, Israel, Israel, Israel. And I was like, well, where are we? And so going back, it was part of my mother's quiet daily resistance to ensure that she could perpetuate this history, even though it was not, written, articulated anywhere, that she would be sure to pass this on to us. And her ability, despite these impossible odds, making it extremely difficult for us to move in and out, to renew our Hawiyya, because at that point you had to renew it, just like Jerusalem, East Jerusalemite Palestinians have to now. If they don't renew it every X number of years, they lose their ability to live, reside, visit Jerusalem. So every year we'd go back to renew it, and it wasn't until we were much older that we truly understood what she was doing, and of course appreciated it. And after I, came to the U.S., studied, went to grad school, met my husband there, and decided I wanted to return back to Gaza, which I ultimately did, and where actually I met Nathan, who's one of the other panelists, was working at the time. Lived there for many years, worked as a journalist, ultimately began blogging, and then shifted towards sort of the documentary angle, did a few films, and the cookbook that you heard about. But it was during those years that I truly I moved in my understanding and thinking of, this struggle is how does one convey this reality that I've described to the outside world? Because even those in my most intimate circle seem to lack sort of a basic understanding of what it meant, how violating it was to be a Palestinian, and how violating the Israeli system was to Palestinian families. It wasn't sort of just these abstractions that we hear about, or these figures or numbers. What does freedom of movement mean? What does desiring, rights and justice mean? These are all sort of big, heavy words, right? But what does it mean to a Palestinian? How does, when we talk about impact on youth and women, and what does all that mean, or the economy and so forth? And so it's these sorts of things that I struggle to be able to convey to people who couldn't really grasp these abstractions. How do you get into Gaza, right? How do you get out? What's the procedure? Who controls it? How have we, sort of as a society, as a world, allowed this to continue for so long? This situation unparalleled anywhere else in the world. A place so isolated, subject to so many, restrictions and so many deliberate policies by so many different countries. It's not like this is something that's happened by accident. How have we allowed this to continue, and why? And so these were the sorts of questions that I sought to answer and trying to reach audiences in different ways, which is why I had the ethnographic cookbook for one, the Gaza Kitchen, that really taught me again to be able to enter those intimate spaces and talk about perpetuating histories in the kitchen and the home. But again, the ID card, and I just talk about that because it was something that's sort of central to, and it also managed, I should say, to fragment the Palestinian population further, right? Such that you had the Palestinians who had the ID cards, and the Palestinians that didn't. Those that had access to the inside of the territory, and those that didn't, right? What does that mean? Most Palestinians, by the way, live outside of Palestine, right? Not inside. I know I don't have a whole lot of time. I'm just going to back up a little bit, and then I'm going to kind of just go through a few of the slides, and then I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to talk a little bit about the impact of the blockade. But really, it was during those years when I was raising my son until he was about 3, who, he's now 15, and writing about my experience raising Yusuf under occupation as a mother. And at the time, I was much younger. I felt it was almost frivolous to be talking about these very personal things, right? In the larger scheme of things, it seemed like there was much more going on. There was houses being demolished, there was people being killed. But it wasn't until I sort of matured a little that I understood that it was being able to convey these sort of very personal details that really resonated with people the most. That they had never heard, they couldn't imagine what a Palestinian kitchen looked like, or what a Palestinian mother would do with their child in Gaza. And it was really mind-boggling to me, which is why I began to focus on documenting those kinds of things. But it was just a struggle of finding diapers during shortages because the Kerem Shalom crossing was closed and a certain number of trucks were not being allowed through. What it meant when I was breastfeeding my child, and I was at the time when there was checkpoints still within the Gaza Strip before the disengagement. What it meant when I was covering a story in Rafah and suddenly I was cut off from my nursing infant in Gaza City for a night, without a breast pump and without anyone else to feed him. Do we think about those details or how that impacts families? What it means when an entire generation of young people who are now 10 and 11 years old, have experienced 3 separate, high-grade military assaults on them, raining down on their tiny, densely packed neighborhoods, and have never left Gaza, have never met anybody outside of Gaza. What does that mean when 100% of the youth in Gaza have expressed, some form of anger or violence, or projected that, or needed psychosocial support? What are we, as American taxpayers, what have we, how are we complicit in all of this, and what can we do? So just, again, really quickly, when we talk about Gaza, again, it's such an abstraction, right? We think of it as this tiny, far away, hostile, place. It's actually, the same size, believe it or not, as the Research Triangle Park, in terms of the number of people. And in terms also of the square mileage, it was pretty impressive. It matches up exactly. However, of course, as you can see, there's many more people packed into those square miles, right? 13,000 versus about 3,000 per square mile. And now that varies where you're looking in Gaza. This really refers to the north of Gaza City in the Jabalia area, right? Where literally you have just tiny little alleys over alleys over alleys. But beyond just being so densely packed, it's, again, the impact of, what that means in terms of the resources that are available or not available for that matter, and so forth. And as Sarah and others, I think, in other panels will get to, the majority of these residents are not from Gaza. We forget that when we hear about the Great March of Return every Friday. 2 Palestinians were shot, including an elderly man yesterday, protesting during that weekly march, demanding their rights to their native homelands. 2 were killed yesterday by Israeli snipers. More than 75 to 80% of the residents of the Gaza Strip are not from the Gaza Strip. They're from villages and towns outside of Gaza and were made refugees. And when they sought shelter in Gaza in 1948, the borders were drawn around them and they were not allowed to return to their homes. And as a result of this decade-long blockade that has deliberately intended to deprive people of their livelihoods, of their productivity, more than 72% are food insecure, meaning they require some type of food assistance to be able to feed their families. Again, what does all of this mean in the context of a place that was once a rich trading town, known for its textile industries and its furniture making and its fruits and its vegetables. Gaza is not historically a poor place, as those of you who are familiar might know. Again, just a quick infographic talking about some figures about Gaza, looking at the outages, 16 to 18 hours, right, of outages on a daily basis. 90% of the water unfit for drinking. A lot of this has to do with the overpumping during the 90s of the settlements for the pools and the organic agriculture and all of this kind of business, and the reroute the water before it reaches Wadi Gaza is routed away from the Gaza Strip. So a lot of different things going on here. Access to healthcare, as you can see, the poverty, agriculture output, how much it has shrunk over the past few years. Again, just another infographic talking about, and I have copies of these in case anyone is interested, talking about when we say Gaza is a closed zone, what does that actually mean? It means that there is a naval blockade, there is an aerial blockade, there is a land blockade, there is no physical possible way to leave the Gaza Strip without approval from an outside source. It's not as though I decide, hey, I'm gonna hop in a bus and go to Washington, or I'm gonna drive, down to Florida. You just can't do that, Everywhere you go, you are surrounded by electric wires, by heavily militarized borders, by, Israeli Navy gunships, by drones circulating overhead every hour of the day. Okay, I'm gonna whiz through the rest of this because I don't have time. Again, as you can see, this is sort of roughly the size of Gaza. This is a map. And this area takes up about half of Gaza's agricultural land along the border, has become this cleared area, complete cleared area called the buffer zone. This is what I refer to when I say the Gaza region before 1948. The shaded area was the area that was called the Gaza district. That would then shrink, and when many of these Palestinians sought refuge there, that area was delineated as the Gaza Strip. So when we talk about the Great March of Return, these are the areas from which the Palestinians came. And this is, again, just another infographic helping you imagine what Gaza looks like today. This is before, what it would have looked like, again, before 1948. Let me go through some of these quickly. This is the Rafah crossing to which I referred. Thousands of Palestinians at any given moment would be waiting entry because the Egyptians would not open. It's not like open 24 hours a day or 7 days a week or whatever. This is a really great, I don't think I have time to show it, but I'm just going to put it up here. You can find it on YouTube. The Israeli organization Gisha put this out a few years ago, and it's just 60 seconds long, but it really helps you understand what we mean when we say Gaza is a closed zone. Maybe if we have time at the end, I can go back and show it. This is my son at the time when I was when I was raising him, when I was living in Gaza. I wanted to start with the disengagement, but I don't have time. But I'll just briefly say 2 words about it. In 2005, it's a sort of seminal year because we hear a lot in the media about, but Israel left Gaza, but what more is there to do, right? It was really what we refer to as a re-engagement in the West Bank, because Israel dismantled its settlements within the Gaza Strip, moved them to the West Bank, retained control over Gaza and its resources and its population registry. Remember I talked about the Hawiyah and the ID card? They still control and govern who gets that, who has access to Gaza and who doesn't, and the taxation system. So really, was it an end to the occupation of Gaza? No, it wasn't, because they retained control over the effective markers of sovereignty over the Gaza Strip. And after that, what happens is Israel has this sort of very, deliberate goal to keep Gaza on the brink of collapse, barely functioning. This is a stated goal, right, after the disengagement. And the outcome, again, according to this fantastic report that Gisha put out, is that it just plunged Gaza into unprecedented economic and humanitarian crisis that it's still reeling from today. And then I'm going to end with, just the, if you just give me 60 more seconds, I'm going to hand it over to her. I know I went over my time, I'm sorry. Then you have sort of the blockade coming full circle, right? It is a continuation of a long-term closure, and I'm sure Sarah will talk about this, on the Gaza Strip. It's not something that just started after Hamas was elected. Been going on since the early 90s in the Oslo Accords, and it's just sort of come full circle, really, in line with the overarching goals of fragmenting the Palestinian population, those in Gaza from the West Bank, from the Palestinians living in Israel, from those living in refugee camps on the outside. And it's really, again, it's a blockade, it's a siege on freedoms, not a siege of foods. And again, the stated goals have been these tenets of the blockade: no development, no prosperity, no humanitarian crisis. Meaning the idea is to really, again, deprive Palestinians, target the productive sectors, just barely allow in a trickle of relief, kind of keep it an intravenous drip of relief, if you will, but never get things so bad that it's a full-fledged humanitarian crisis. And in line with that, factories were targeted, the agricultural sector was targeted. There's a naval restriction on how far fishermen can fish out into sea, right? It's waivers between 3 to 12 nautical miles. In Oslo, it was supposed to be 20 nautical miles. Maritime law says it's supposed to be 200 nautical miles. So as a result, Palestinians in Gaza fish without water, farm without land. This is in the northern area of the buffer zone. And the complete economic collapse. I have to, end it here and hand it over to Sarah. But again, really, how has this impacted youth? And again, half of Gaza's population are under 25. Youth who are unable to go and access institutions of higher education without extreme lobbying and pre-approved permits. What is their outlook and vision? How has it impacted? My daughter, she's in 5th grade, but she just did a big presentation on this, and I was talking to her about it. I was like, what did you discover? And she goes, I discovered that it's not just, the physical aspect, the bombs or whatever, it's the psychosocial impact, where children in Gaza, see a campfire and they completely, freak out because of what it reminds them of. We hosted a child from Gaza through the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund, and for about 5 minutes, even though I live there and I know, but it's gotten so much worse, he just went like this with the lights. He flicked them on and off and on and off and on and off. And then he went into the shower and he stood there for half an hour. He could not fathom that we had electricity 24 hours a day and hot water running in our tap nonstop. Just to put things in perspective. I have to end here. Maybe I'll just talk about this really quickly. Did I go way past my time? I did. I'm done. Okay, I'm going to go back. I'm sorry. But I just wanted to talk. I mentioned this yesterday, but when I talk about the impact on women and what it means, it's not, when we think of resistance and struggle to all of this, again, it's not just the kind of in-your-face, the obvious, in the streets, rallying, protesting. But because of the longevity, the burden then falls on women, right? When 40% of Palestinian men are or have been incarcerated as political prisoners by Israel. Where does that leave the women and the family, And when I talk about the role of women in again, being the binders, holding the family together, perpetuating the history, being the storytellers for the family, all of that becomes just so important. I'm gonna hand it over now, I'm so sorry, I could keep going all day, but.